Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Good morning, everyone. Pat Flynn here, coming at you recorded from Washington, D.C. It is Sunday morning. That means it's time for Sunday School. So, some kind of fun news. My church actually invited me to be an official Sunday school teacher to children of around the 4th grade. So that's going to be fun. I don't know how good of a job I will do with teaching kids. We shall see. I'm in charge of instructing them in the moral philosophy, so to speak. Now, it's going to be much simpler than that, teaching things like the Beatitudes and so on and so forth. But, morality has been and I know I keep coming back to it. I always will, because I find this subject deeply fascinating. Morality is something we all assume, right? We all assume that there's some right or wrong in the world aside from those 10 people who are moral nihilists walking around in certain university halls. But we don't always unpack that. We just work on that assumption. We don't always try to figure out, where does this morality come from? What is morality? And I guess if there's one thing I want to do from the religious perspective, especially when it comes to the Christian perspective, is that, morality is not just an arbitrary set of rules. And I think that's the biggest mischaracterization that people have when they're looking at something like Christianity and they see, well, here's a great example, the Ten Commandments. They think that this is just some old, archaic set of rules. Or even, the commandments that Jesus gave, or the Beatitudes. And nothing could be further from the truth. Now I held this misconception for a long time. I thought, those were just the rules of the past, just there to try and keep people down and obedient to the church. I could not have a more opposite opinion than that now. So as I go and I prepare my notes and my lectures and presentations for these wonderful children, who will see how interested they are in anything I actually have to say, the biggest thing I want to make clear is that God always wants what is best for us. And God knows what is best for us. God knows what's better for us than we will ever know, especially long term. Sometimes God is like a dentist, and I bring this up because I was at the dentist the other day, in the sense that if we ask God to help us and to cure us and to give us what is best for us, if we decide that we do want to follow God's will, well, sometimes it's like going to the dentist in the sense that, and I was fortunate, by the way, no cavities, no root canals, nothing. I had a lump on my gum, small little lump. I was concerned. And it's not like a huge pus infection where you're just going to have to put me to sleep and drill on me for hours. And I don't know why, the hypochondriac in me kind of jumped to the immediate. But yeah, I went in bravely, and and here's what I figured. I figured I'm going to tell this dentist everything. I'm not going to hide anything from the dentist, because this dentist is going to know what's best for me in my mouth, and it might involve some short-term pain. She would not be a good dentist if she just lied to me and said, "Don't worry about it." If there was something really wrong with my gums, thankfully there isn't. There might have been an adjustment period where she had to drill me or do some type of surgery that might have been very unpleasant for me at first, but in the long term, that's what would have been good for me. Now, I have to say the same is very much true when it comes to morality, especially in the Christian sense. Okay, if we know that ontologically speaking, and I'm sorry for always bringing in some verbiage. By the way, when we talk about the suchness of something, so when we talk about moral ontology, we're trying to study the nature of morality. What is morality? Where does it come from? Does it actually exist, or is it only a figment of our mind? And we've had that discussion many times. The conclusion being is, in a world, if God did not exist, then we could not have objective moral values and duties. We could not have moral values and duties that are valid and binding, independent of human opinion, which is a real problem. That's a real big problem, because then it just means that morality is an illusion, and there really is no right or wrong or moral obligation. And this is the question that often This is the question that often is very bothering to people who are not associated with any spiritual or religious tradition, because the immediate thing they'll say is, "Oh, well, you telling me I can't be good if I'm not a religious person?" No, not saying that at all. What we're saying is there's just no such good thing to begin with if God does not exist. if God does not exist. So it's much deeper than that. Of course, you can be a good person no matter what you believe. That's just because you don't believe in a particular creed or religion or God or even God's will doesn't mean you still can't come in line with it. Of course, you can. Especially from the Christian tradition, we believe that the moral law is written on all of our hearts to begin with. So that's a question, however, of moral epistemology. So moral ontology looks at the nature of morality. Moral epistemology looks at how do we come to know of morality. So once we, kind of figure out that, morality does exist, there are some things that are truly right, other things that are truly wrong, then we ask the question, okay, how do we come to figure that out? That's moral epistemology. Most people are focused on moral epistemology. They're not as much focused on moral ontology. Now, most of my studies have been on ontology. I'm most interested in that question, because if we can get first, then I'm kind of open to all sorts of moral epistemology. And there's, of course, many systems out there. There's just the straight up religious perspective. Hey, we have what Jesus taught us. We have the Ten Commandments. We have, and so on and so forth. And those are great, but not a lot of people accept the revelation account. Catholics have natural law, which I'm also a big proponent of, and have really come to appreciate. There's virtue ethics, in the Aristotelian tradition, and then there's all the Enlightenment style, Kant's deontology, utilitarianism, which I think is just utterly bunk, and things like that. So there's many systems of moral epistemology, of how do we come to figure out what is right and wrong. Now, I would say anything that tries to be totally secular is always going to fail, because it will never pass the ontological test. But there's a lot of proximate means, like natural law and virtue ethics, I think can be very helpful. Natural law and virtue ethics, I think can be very helpful. Let me go back to my original example of the dentist, however, because I said, if I knew there was something wrong with me and I went to the dentist and I was going to tell her everything, then I may have expected some short-term pain for some long-term benefit. I think we need to look at the religious morality the same way. If we see that all moral values are grounded in God, that something is good because God is good. God is the ultimate measure of goodness. He is the standard of goodness itself. God doesn't will things to be good arbitrarily, and God isn't under some moral law like we are. God just is that source and foundation for all moral values, of all goodness and justice and fair play and righteousness and so on. Any moral value you think of, it is a reflection of God's character. But then we have God's will, or God's commandments, and this is where moral duties come from. And this is the really interesting part of moral philosophy. We not only feel that some things are good and bad, or good and evil, but we also feel that some things are right and wrong. We feel this pressing. We feel this obligation. The classic example is you're walking to work and you see a child, 10 feet, out in front of you, like drowning in a pool. Like, almost every one of us would say we have a moral obligation to go save that child. And if somebody said they didn't, we'd say there's something seriously wrong with you. Your moral sense is impaired, just like people's visual sense can be impaired. Like, you need help. Now, why is this? And how do we account for moral values? Well, with God, it's actually quite simple. We see that moral obligations stem and duties stem from God's will, which is simply a reflection of God's character. Now, why does this matter? Why is this important? And you can let me know if you think that this will go way over the kids' heads. I got to try and simplify this down. I'm just testing it all. It comes down to trust in God. If we know that God is all good and God loves us, God will whatever is best for us. Now, here's the problem with that, and it is a problem because we have our own free will, and we often want things that aren't very good for us. And I would say most of us probably want more things that aren't very good for us than we do want things that are good for us. So that's when we look at these, a lot of these religious creeds and religious foundations of morality, and we say, that's not a big deal. Like, take the Ten Commandments, right? No, I think the Ten Commandments are generally pretty agreeable. I think, and this is a position where I've changed my mind on almost everything especially since becoming Catholic and studying natural law and saying, because, before, like I said, especially when Catholic teaching, I thought, oh my goodness, this all seems so arbitrary. And then you study it like, okay, now I get it. Now on social teaching, sexual teaching, all of this and that. We're going to do a few episodes on the sex stuff soon, I promise. But God is sort of that dentist. As soon as you give yourself over to God's will, there might be a painful readjustment process. There certainly was for me, where you are going to, I would say this, if you truly do become converted on a deep level, and you want to come in line with God's will, you can do two things you can expect. One, you can expect your life to become a whole lot better in many ways, because you're essentially just doing what you ought to do. God is the center of oughtness. He wills whatever is best for us because he loves us. So our lives will greatly improve. And I've said this before, morality done right is really a blueprint for human flourishing. That's the easiest way to think of it. So to ask, why should I do what God wants me to do? It's like asking, why ought I to do what I ought to do? It's a silly question. God is the very source and foundation of oughtness. Nobody knows what's better for you than God. So that's what the morality is there for. It's not about some silly meta-narrative power grab or trying to oppress people or keep people obedient and coming to church and fearing hellfire. It's not that at all. These are just obscene misrepresentations, and of course I used to believe every one of them. But in coming into alignment with God's will, there is often a certain realignment process, because you want one thing, but what is really good for you is another. And we've talked about this before. Something isn't good just because you desire it. We can think of many examples where people desire things that are not good for them, even on the extreme, certain addictive behaviors, right? Excessive amounts of drugs or alcohol or addictions to electronics or video games. There's so many things that people want that are really not good for them. Now, getting away from those things is a painful process. Moving towards what is actually and really good for them is often a painful process, like going to the dentist, getting the tooth drilled. With me so far? So this was a lesson I learned the hard way. I had and still have a lot of really bad habits. I do not ever want to make it seem like I'm preaching from a pulpit from some sort of moral high ground. I am about as depraved as it gets. But relative to myself, because when you really do come into that loving relationship with God, and you really do just kind of put your hands up and say, all right, you know what's best for me. Just let me try and do what you have said is best for me. And I'm going to do the best I can. I'm going to need your help. That's one thing. Always ask for the help. I'm going to need your help to live out your commandments, to live out your will, the Beatitudes, what Jesus taught, all this and so forth. I'm going to do my best. And then you realize that's really difficult, because 9 out of the 10 things, at least that I wanted in my life, do not line up for that. Do not line up with that at all. So it's been a tremendous challenge, but my life has improved in so many more respects, and you give up these things that you thought you might have never been able to live without. And then you realize, not only could I live without those things, but my life is so much better now that I've stopped, doing these things. And this could, be anything from, again, the tough sexual teaching, which will self, to just telling little lies, white lies throughout the day. And that was something I was telling my wife on the way down here, is how much better my life has been since I kind of got out of the habit of white lying or trying to, because, God gave us mouths so that we could speak the truth, not deceive people. Now, this isn't to say that we're looking at moral absolutism. We talked about that before. That's not true, right? There's some circumstances where lying might be not only justified, but the right thing to do. And you can think of a situation where you're trying to protect somebody's life, for example. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about situations where it's just, you're just trying to cover yourself or whatever. Maybe you made a mistake. You don't want to own up for the mistake, so you blame it on the kids, right? Oh, sorry, I didn't show up on time. My kids gave me a bunch of trouble. That actually happened to me, and I'm hardly ever late, right? But it's easy to be oh yeah, sorry, the kids were a real nuisance this morning, which was not true, and I didn't say that. I didn't say that. I didn't say that. You just kind of get out of this habit and just, take it upon yourself. And it feels really good, actually. And you realize, okay, that was a little bit more difficult up front. But now, I don't have that little twinge of guilt anymore. And guilt, everyone's like, don't ever feel guilty, this or that. No, guilt's there for a reason. Like God gave us guilt for a reason. Now, of course, that could be overplayed. You can over-attach to guilt. That's no good either. But, guilt sometimes is there to kind of like give you that little pinch that you need. Like, hey, you shouldn't have been doing that. You shouldn't have be telling all these little white lies all the time. So there might be really big adjustments in your life, and there might be really small adjustments. For me, it's been kind of a mixture of both since my reconversion to Christianity and Catholicism in particular. And that was one of the things, especially when I came to the Catholic Church. And we have so many things to talk about for, whether you're listening, whether you're just spiritual but not religious, whether you're Protestant or whether you're Catholic. There's a million things I need to talk about. Spiritual but not religious, whether you're Protestant or whether you're Catholic. There's a million things I need to talk about in relation to the Catholic Church, especially in recent news. But it was one of these things is as I studied it, as I began to appreciate it, I refused to be like what I saw so many of my other family members who were nominally Catholic, which is they would just take whatever their viewpoints were, and at political or spiritual otherwise, and just back them into their faith, right? So they would just make Catholicism whatever they wanted it to be, or even Christianity whatever they wanted it to be. But that never made sense to me. And we can speak of both Christianity specifically, or in general, or Catholicism in specific. It's like, whose religion am I following here? My own or God's? If I'm going to follow my own religion, then I might as well not be religious at all, just be vaguely spiritual. I'll take on some vanilla brand spirituality. And I've been there, and I realized that just wasn't enough. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to figure out, okay, how does God need to have a relationship with him? That's the question. How does God want me to have a relationship with him? And it was the studying of this question that ultimately brought me back to Christianity. And but when you do that, you realize it's God's will, not your will, and that God knows what is really best for us. And he has explained it pretty well of what we need to do to have an optimal, loving, saving relationship with him. There are certain patterns, behaviors, modes of thought, etc., that are better than worse. Loving your neighbor is better than being absolutely self-centered in everything you do. Loving God above all else is better than loving video games above all else, right? So some of these things are really, really basic, but we don't always think of them or adhere to them. And, let's just take those two basic commandments, right? Love God above all else and love your neighbor as yourself. These were the this is what Jesus taught us to that. So I'll say the first commandment was difficult for me because even as I, began my reconversion process, I would say, okay, I'm definitely there. My heart has been moved, but is this the most important thing in my life right now? And that was a slow process, and I had to do, I had to actively readjust myself. I had to go to the dentist, so to speak, and get some drill work done to make sure, okay, and you pray over it, you ask for help. I would say, God, I'm ready and fully prepared to commit to this. Help me make our relationship the most important thing in my life. And I did a couple things to do that. One is, and the timing was pretty fortuitous. In the Catholic tradition, we had Lent coming up, so my sacrifice for Lent, because Lent is about, people think that, again, there's this arbitrary, just don't eat hamburger meat on Lent. No, it's really about kind of joining in on the sacrifice. My sacrifice, so that way I could really, and this was a sacrifice for me because of a couple reasons. One, my daily mass where I live is around 9 a.m., and 9 a.m. is like my peak productivity time in work and writing. Now, before all of this, work and writing were extremely important to me. I put almost, my greatest energy and attention during the day on work and writing, even more so than working out. Usually working out comes after my work and writing projects. So what I was doing was I was taking what is the most productive and valuable time in my day and giving that to God. That was my way of saying, you know what's best for me. I'm going to commit to it, and I'm going to do it. And I built that habit. So this was me having to build a new habit. And I just used the principles of generalism, which I talk about, right? Short-term specialization, and said every day at 9 a.m. I'm going to go to Mass, and I'm going to go early, and I'm going to meditate, I'm going to pray, I'm going to stay a little bit after, I'm going to meditate, I'm going to pray, and I have to go early, and I'm going to meditate, I'm going to pray, I'm going to stay a little bit after, I'm going to meditate, I'm going to pray, and I have not left that habit since. So even when I'm traveling, I actually love traveling because it helps me. I'm kind of this Catholic nerd now where I go around, I hunt out churches in the area and stuff like that, but whatever. So, making that the most important part of my day was part of that realignment process, and it was very tough. I'm a very type A person. I take my work and my writing very seriously. So to interrupt that, to pull away from that through what is my peak time, by the way, and in the middle of some very tight book deadlines, no less. I feel like that was a very significant sacrifice for me to make, but here's the thing, as difficult as it was one of the most transformative experiences of my life. There's nothing I cherish more now than that daily Mass experience, that daily dedication and prayer time that I have. And have given to God. It was one example of how I've had to completely realign something where I had all these other priorities. And you can just kind of hand wave at commandments and morality and be like, oh, okay, yeah, God, we're pals, we're on good footing. But that's not enough, is it? Like this is the number one commandment, and this is where we talked about the virtues last time of temperance, and I said use that first commandment and the second commandment as a measure for one to practice the Christian virtue of temperance, of when to pull back on things. If anything else is creeping up as a higher priority of your relationship with God and how you treat other people, you need to exhibit temperance on those things. You need to pull back on those things and reshape your priorities in life. So, what am I getting at? This was me going to the dentist and being drilled, and I think that this is how it works. It has to work for that authentic relationship to happen, and for that authentic us to happen. And it's like, just to give an example, people sometimes who are outside the Catholic Church think of, Catholicism has this idea of good works, right? And this is something that, again, something I totally misunderstood. But good works is just what I'm talking about. Good works isn't the idea that, I have to do this many good deeds or give this much money to charity to get in heaven. No. Good works is what falls out automatically from a loving, saving relationship with God and Christ. That's what it means. Like me turning myself over to God, saying, you know what is best for me. Help me come in line with that and give me the grace to get it done, right? It's not something that you do on your own. It's something that you make the decision to come into that relationship. God's grace helps you come into that decision, and then he gives you the grace to fulfill that relationship, and out of that relationship falls these good works. It's sort of an it's sort of an inevitable it's an inevitable thing that happens, and you see it happen all the time, and it's happened in my life, and that was something that really kind of helped me to quote unquote get it. And we'll do an episode on that entire doctrine as well, because that was something that I really misunderstood for a long time. I'm like, wait, if I become Catholic, does that mean that I have to like do all these deeds and like meet all these rules? And that isn't it at all. It's actually everything that I've just been describing. So if you've been nodding your head along with this, like, yeah, that makes sense, then at least one part of the Catholic Church and tradition makes sense to you. But this is shared, of course, among many Christians, even if they don't all think of it in the same way, and even if they don't all call it the same thing. And this is something I've really discovered in dialoguing with so many different people. It's just how much you really do agree on, even though we don't always think of it in the same terms or from the same. Applies to everybody, regardless of denomination or even religion, is that idea of morality is here as the key to human flourishing, the key to finding imperfect happiness here on earth. And obviously, perfect happiness is not something that you find in this life, but the next life. But we can approximate it. We can get closer to that perfect happiness here on earth. And following that, coming in line with God's will is the way to do this. But it's not an easy thing. It's a very difficult thing. I don't want to say it's it's like, I'm going to use a dentist analogy too. It's not so difficult as you have to work for it. You just have to accept it. That's the key, right? You have to ask for it sincerely, and you have to accept it sincerely. Then God really does most of the work for you. He gives you the grace to get it done in the same way that you just have to ask the dentist sincerely. Your dentist drills away. So I don't want you to think of it as having to make any really great effort. You just have to think of it as being sincere and wanting for you what God also wants for you. That's the right way to think about it. I think, anyways, and that's how I've come to think about it, and that's how I've come to experience it. Like I said, I've changed things about my life that I know I would never have ever been able to do before, and some of them are quite embarrassing, and maybe we'll do an episode on those, but I would never ever have been able to do it before outside of the context that I'm now in. Just as the same sense, I would never have been able to drill my own tooth. You just have to accept it and sincerely and go along with it. And that transformation, that renewal process will happen inevitably from a sincere, open, loving, saving relationship with God. Sorry, we got a little tickle in my throat there. So these are just some initial thoughts on... sorry, we got a little tickle in my throat there. So these are just some initial thoughts on, and we'll dive into specifics on another episode. We will dive into the Beatitudes and the Ten Commandments, because these are something, again, as I continue to study them, just blossom with richness and beauty and wisdom. Richness and beauty and wisdom that I never saw and never understood before. So I'm excited to get into that. And boy, has that not just been the lesson for the entire Bible to me. Again, something that I thought for most of my life was just some archaic collection of crusty papers actually turned out to be, one of the most significant and important things in my life. So, it's funny. Positions can change, minds can change. Mine certainly have. But in the meantime, I keep pressing this. We will get off the topic of morality at some point. But the reason I think morality is so important is because so much of what we talk about on this show is about self-improvement. And here I am saying that there's this perfect blueprint from God that just is self-improvement, right? Like, here are the instruction manuals from the Creator for how to most optimally run the human organism. And so many of us are ignoring it. And just, imagine that. You go and you find this big machine and you just try to run it however you want. Now, the person who designed the machine standing, right next to you, and he's saying, no, not like this, and you just keep using it however you want. How silly. You'll probably break the machine. You'll probably ruin the machine. Well, I think most of us do, until we come into that recognition that, all that God wants is what is best for us. And then just try and come into that, acceptance of that and be like, okay, let's do this. Let's go. You know better than I do. I want all these things. They haven't made me happy. They're not making me any happier. In fact, they're making me a lot more miserable. I've been in that situation. So I'm going to take your advice, God, all right, and you're going to try your way. Now, you can't be like about that, right? You have to be sincere about it. You have to really want it and allow that grace to work. And grace is a whole other thing that I never understood it until I started practicing it. So just gives me so much more to talk about as we move along here. But I'm going to wrap it up today. In the meantime, I would encourage everybody. I'm going to, I'll link some resources in the show notes that I think might be helpful for people on trying to better understand. I actually gave a talk at Holy Apostles College not too long ago on the topic of moral ontology, a guest lecture there. Since I have spent most of my time on that. So I'll link that if anybody wants to listen, wants to kind of see, what is morality in the deepest sense. So I'll link that, but then I'll link some other resources. Deepest sense. So I'll link that, but then I'll link some other resources again that have been helpful for me in better understanding what the epistemological side and how God works within us to renew us, to bring us into a relationship with Him, and how that relationship automatically aligns us to the good, puts us in alignment with the good of what is really and truly good for us. So anyway, I'm actually about to head off to church here. We're in D.C., so we are going to see what it's all about down here and take the Sunday and try and relax. We're with Christine's family. We were at a gender reveal party. Her brother is having a baby boy, it turns out. So we were celebrating that over the weekend. Always a lot of fun, and always great to see family and all that. So I hope all of you are having a great weekend. Hope you have a wonderful Sunday. And if you listen to this episode and you enjoy these Sunday school conversations, please do me a favor. Rank the podcast. Hit subscribe. Helps bring people into the fold. You know, the Sunday school is just me trying to share what has been most helpful to me, and that I think also hopefully will be helpful to you. So if you get value out of it, please let me know. And the best way.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.